Okay, welcome everybody. So today I'm going to walk us through the process of texturing the weapon. This is assuming that you've gone through the previous two tutorials of unwrapping, where we have all of our different parts laid out in the UV map. And from here, what we need to do is to export our map into an image that we can edit in Photoshop. So in the UV editor here, in UV editor, I go to the image menu, choose UV snapshot, change my size to 1024 by 1024. That is a typical texture size or a default texture size for this kind of object. If you're doing, say, a desktop PC game, right, you might double this. But we'll just assume that it's going to be a pretty standard size or optimized type of object. So I'm going to save this down as UV snapshot into my same folder. I might want to put this into source images so that it's tucked away a little bit. And as a PNG file, so that will save the transparency as well. So when I hit apply, it's going to ask me, tell me that I don't have a valid selection, so I need to make sure I'm in object mode and have my object selected. Then apply, it saves down that PNG. So now I can track down that file. I have it saved here, UV snapshot, and I'm going to put that into Photoshop. So as you can see, it's all see-through and ghostly. I'm going to create a new layer and just make it a white layer in the background so that I can see that wireframe. I don't need my timeline, so I'll close that. Alrighty, so this is going to be the map for our texture, right? We call it a texture map, and it is literally the map of where everything on the texture is going to be landing. So once I have this set up, I just want to make sure that I label this layer as UV map, because I will be showing and hiding this layer as I move forward. First thing I'm going to do is create a new layer underneath. I might change the blending mode here at a future time, but for now, since I don't have any color laid down, I'm going to leave it as is. Then on my middle layer or underneath layer, I'm going to start laying in big old color splotches for these different materials, right? So if I forget what something looks like, I can always go back or refer back to Maya and look at what each part corresponds to, right? Because sometimes the shapes of these parts sometimes just don't really map well to our brain. So to start with the most obvious shape, right, this here, this little guy is actually bothering me that this one is out of place. Where are you, little man? So what I need to do, right, is start laying down my overall color. I might have done this previously, but I'll just wanted to start from 0. Typically, since I want to section these parts off, right, I'll actually just select a large area around that piece and then fill that with a color. So notice again that I still have my UV as a separate map, and I'm working on a layer underneath it. That's going to just be the steel for the head of the axe. Next, I have to think about the wooden handles, right? So I'm going to try and grab that next little section while making sure that I'm not touching any of these other bits, although this conical part at the bottom will be made of wood as well. I'll include that in my selection. This part is the top of the axe head, so I'll include that. Then I'll just choose a stand-in kind of brown color for the wood bit. Again, making sure that I'm on the middle layer. I'm going to rename this to my color layer. And then move forward to the next part, which is the gemstone in the eyeball. That I wanted to have it be like an emerald green. And this part here is a strap of leather that is tied from this hole to the handle. And I know that I wanted my leather to have kind of a reddish hue. So I'm just going to put a red color in that block. A lot of people will fill in the rest of those white shapes too, just so they're not too distracting. So in my case, maybe using a lighter gray would be one way to do that. I still need to figure out what I'm doing up here for this section. For this part, I wanted to have 2 strands of cloth hanging down. So I'll go back to my kind of cloth color, go to my color layer, fill those in. And then I also wanted to have 2 kind of rings hanging from those pieces of cloth. So maybe a ring about this size, a bit of a darker gray, well, it's not quite centered. Oops. So I'm going to make sure, catch that. And for this one, I'm going to use Alt to create the circle from the center. Oops, I'm setting off all sorts of alarm bells. Okay, so yes, I'm going to have this be a ring right in the center here, but in fact what I actually want, right, is like that cloth to be kind of wrapping around the inside of the ring. So I'll just brush that in as well. So I don't need to make the center of the ring invisible just yet, because I'm going to be taking care of that with an alpha map. Right, so even though these parts are visible right now, I won't necessarily worry about it. From this point, I'm going to go File, Save As. I'll keep it as a Photoshop document, a PSD, and I'll rename it to something like, let's be proper here, we'll use our last name, the name of our weapon, and then the color map is the one that we're working with. So color or diffuse will be the name of this one. Hit save, hit OK. Now I left my alpha map visible, so since I'm about to apply it to my object, I'm going to jump back into Maya and set this up as my texture. So I'm going to hide that wireframe there, hit Control S to save it, and then jump back into Maya. I'm going to open up the Hypershade and create a new texture ball. Just use Blend for now. Then I'm looking for the color slot, and I'm going to choose a file option and link in the file that I just created, which I put under source images, Simpson X color, right? So Photoshop can or Maya can understand a Photoshop file, which is lucky for us. Then I'll select the object, apply, so I can see just where I'm at the moment. Yeah. So texture's looking fine. Notice that when I created my weapon, right, I purposefully created the UV map with splits between where one material started and the other material began, like here between the wood and the steel, right? So I still need to think about where I'm going to have this X handle, right, and this leather strap coming across. It's going to be across this line here, and it's going to extend down to the very bottom. So all of this from here downwards is going to all be this leather strap color. So now I can jump back into my texture map and make sure that I'm reflecting that here in the color map. So I'm just going to keep using the selection tool for now. Try to be accurate along here. And fill that area with that red cloth color. Make sure that I hide my UV map, hit save. And if I have my UV editor open, it looks like it will auto refresh on that color update. So here already, right, I have that change reflected in the 3D model. It is worth noting though that oftentimes, say if I change the gem color from green to blue, get a sapphire, oops, right, and I save that, it's not automatically going to pop in as soon as I jump back into Maya. Often what I'll have to do is close and reopen the hypershade for it to link or relink that file from the texture onto the object. So I'll undo that, go back to my green eyeball. Again, it's not immediately shown. Close the hypershade, open it back up, and it will be there. Now let's just test that with the UV editor open. I'll try a different color. So it looks like if I have the UV editor open, I just need to kind of scroll or move the UV editor, and that will also update because it's now it's checking this file that's linked in to the object there. So just worth noting that that update isn't necessarily as snappy as it could be, right? There's still a bit of delay between Photoshop and Maya. Now, at this point, I'm ready to create my other texture maps. So I need to start thinking about the different material types that I've got represented here. This is going to be either a leather or a cloth type of material along the handle for gripping. Same with down here. Obviously the axe head is going to be a steel, and the main branch is made of a dark wood. So the next thing I need to do is do a file save as, and I'm going to save as Specular, which is how shiny the different parts of the object are. So I like to use save as because, again, I keep my UV map coordinates, and I also have a basic layout for different materials now. So I'm going to go to Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, or I could just go to Adjustments, Desaturate on that layer, because the specular map is a grayscale image, right? So depending on how light or dark different areas are going to change how much they reflect light as I pan across the object, right? As it catches the light, is it going to be very bright along that edge, or is it going to be less so? So right off the bat, let's say that I'm using cloth for the handle, right? Cloth is not very reflective, so I would want that to be here. Let me turn on contiguous and change the cloth color here and here to be much darker. Wood, however, can be somewhat reflective, right? Like wood, if you have put some varnish on it, can have a little bit of shine to it. So if it's if it's older like driftwood, it's going to be very dull and not shiny at all. But it's not bad to have maybe a little bit of shine to that wood. So maybe let's just darken it ever so slightly. The axe head, right, that's going to be made of steel, so it's not that steel is a mirror shine, but it is more than like the 50% kind of mark, so I'll lighten up that axe head. I also need to lighten up the rings in here. I have to turn down my tolerance really low. So the rings that are silver or of steel, same color as there. And by far, right, the shiniest object is the gem, which I'm assuming is a cut gem. And that's going to be close to a mirror shine, so it is going to be the brightest object and the most reflective in my scene. So I turn off my UV map, right, move my texture map is looking a little bit chunky here. Maybe I'll do a tiny bit of cleanup. Right, that'll act as the starter for my specular map. Oh, I forgot these pieces up here are going to be cloth, so they will need to be the same color as these cloth pieces here. Did it go? I think it went too dark. Maybe it's just imagination. Alright, so I save my specular map. I'm going to reopen my color map, right, and I can see if I flip between them that the layout is identical between them. Now, if I go back to my Hypershade editor, I need to link that specular map onto my object, so I'll get to an area or a view in my viewport where I can see the shine across the object. That way I'll be able to see it when I change it. I'm going to go to specular color slot in my texture, choose file, and link in that Photoshop document that I just created. And here you can see immediately, right, the low shininess on the cloth pieces versus the very shiny steel pieces and the extremely shiny gemstone, right, which is catching all the light. So specular gives us an idea of the different materials, and it is a grayscale file. The next thing we have to worry about is the bump map. So again, I'm going to go File, Save As, choose and call it Bump. And then I'll reopen my specular map just so that I have it here. Now, for the bump map, this is going to be slightly different because what happens in a bump map is it will raise and lower parts of this model in the renderer without adding geometry. So the most obvious place that I can show you guys on mine is if I'm going to have this be, say, cloth wrapped around the handle here, or leather wrapped around the handle, right? It's going to start right here where I have the edge of the strap going back, and it's going to loop around this section here. Right now, it's just a plain red, and it's all one piece. However, in the bump map, I want to have the edges of the cloth represented, so I'm going to actually paint that in. Now, right now, I have a lot of variation in the colors on my bump map, which isn't really what I want. In a bump map, what is going to be the most neutral is, we would say, 128 gray or 127 gray, right? So this is right in the middle between 0, which is pure black, and 255, which is pure white, right? If we go to a 128 gray, 129 close, for red, green, and blue, right? Then we get that perfect middle mark. Now, it's best to start with that 128 rather than immediately having a whole lot of variation on here, because on a bump map, it's going to be sensitive to raising and lowering, not just one or the other. So in this case, I'm going to raise up some strands along the cloth, right? So said if I looked at my UVs again, that this was the start of the cloth there. So if I had cloth on this handle, right, make sure I'm on my color layer, then I would have the start of that cloth raised up ever so slightly compared to the position of the wood. Right. Now, technically, the rest of this would also be raised up. So I could select from down here. And fill this also with that lighter gray. Then I want to have the cloth layered on top of itself. So if I'm going to have straps, right, they're going to be starting from here. A top strap maybe will have one that runs all the way across. So that represents the top, and then one that starts where it is wrapped on the side. So let's start to create a pattern like this. So representing strands of cloth wrapped around the object. Now, I don't know why I'm using my mouse when I have my Wacom right in front of me. Let me go back and make some nicer line work. Oops, go all the way to that edge. Oh, and then same thing at the bottom here, right? This would be the last strand of cloth that would be wrapped around, so assume that that one takes up the bottom, and then I have a strand that kind of gets tucked in right there. Alright, so this will be the start of my bump map. I'm going to save this because I've already named it, and with my UV map hidden. And I'll go back to the Hypershade editor and link that file into my texture file. So my blend, go to bump/normal mapping, click on the checkerboard, choose file. Now it's asking me another step, so bump value, and then I can choose the file, bump.psd, hit open. And as soon as I do that, you can see that those strands of cloth are now represented as a change in height on my model. So I've got this issue now where, remember when I UV unwrapped the model, right, I left a texture seam at the front, which is now something I have to worry about, where at the back of the model my lines are nice and clean, but here they're not quite lining up, they're a little bit offset. So in that case, really, my only option is to kind of go back and rework these lines so that they kind of match up closer to what the UV is expecting. Not the greatest problem to have, but let's just say for now that we'll leave it just so we can move on to the next texture map. One thing we should also look at though for bump is it's important to think about adding little details on your weapon that make it seem like it's been used. So on a 3D object, right, if I was carrying this weapon around, I need to think about which faces would get scuffed up and scratched as I was carrying it, right, and swinging it against like my armor or hitting enemies with it, right, where it would get scratched versus areas that would be relatively untouched, right? So like down in here, it's unlikely that anything is ever going to hit it. This is going to be areas that are like more dusty and grimy. This edge here, right, being the highest edge along the object, whenever I put this thing down on a table or throw it on the ground or something, right, this edge is going to get scuffed up a lot. So in those type of areas, again, I'm going to look in my bump map for this. Although typically what I'll do is I'll work in the color map and then copy that across. So make a new layer called scratches in my color map. And then in here with a very thin brush, I'm going to start adding scratches. This will represent areas. Let me just make sure that I'm catching the right ones. It's these 2, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so it's actually a little bit up here. Just move that over. That's the only thing on this layer. Alright, so assuming that this weapon gets used in the real world, it's going to get a little bit of wear and tear to it. So assuming that this character drops or puts down their weapon at all, right, that it's not just coming straight off the factory floor, we want to add little details in here that are going to make it feel like it's used by a person. So other areas that might happen, right, is like back here, might be scuffs or chips. And typically you'll work from the edges inwards, right? That'll kind of give you areas like this that become quite scratched. So let's just say that that's all we're looking to do. Right, just very simple series of scuffs there. What I will then do is have that as a separate layer, right? I'll copy that layer and I'm gonna actually put that onto my bump map as well. So I'll do it special paste in place so that it lines up perfectly with my color map. First, let's just see what it looks like with color on it. So again, to update my map, I'm gonna open the hypershade. I can see the start of that taking place. And then I will save the bump map with that information as well, just to show you how that can get multiplied. So in this case, what I've actually done is, for a color map, yes, the scratches would be lighter color, right, to expose the new steel underneath. But on a bump map, the lighter color is getting raised up, which is not producing the correct effect here, right? It's actually making it look a bit strange. So on a bump map, for that section, I would invert those colors to a black, which then pushes the colors in. Also, might reduce the opacity just because it looked like it was working overtime. So if I flip that with an invert, now you'll see we get more of the effect that I was trying for, right? So since I'm only using 1024 textures, the pixelation, right, on my strokes is going to show, but from holding the weapon at a distance, right, that area will kind of start to look more appropriate. It's just that I haven't really gone through and scuffed up the other areas. The other way that you can use bump maps is actually to get something like a cloth material and just bring it directly into your texture by overlaying it. So let me see here if I've got maybe one of these. The only thing is that we also have to worry about the highlights and lowlights in the image itself. Right, so another method, let's use this guy, Gotcha. Another method you might want to use, depending on how you like to Photoshop things, right, is to go grab photo reference and to use that as a basis for your material. Now, for getting a hand-painted look, I wouldn't want to just slap this in place, right? Like that was what we did with the real-time strategy model, is we just would have like a photo texture there. Rather, if I'm using, if I'm aiming for like a painterly style, I'm just going to have that reference on the layer, and instead of just pasting it in place, right, I'm actually going to try and work that texture by getting up close. So if I go back to these, I assume this is my whole area that I'm going to be working with, right? So I'll just make a new layer, call it the cloth layer. And then seeing that I will have variation in color here, right, based on this handle, lower opacity, right, is now I can start to add sort of that inconsistency in texture or whatever types of effects based on kind of what my eye is seeing over here, right? So instead of just overlaying that material directly, I'm going to try and almost like recreate it, right, with some areas being very worn and dirty, and working between large brushes, going back to like small brushes for details. Right, then switching it up to some highlights. So don't just want to work on one or the other, right? In this case, the highlights are a bit bright, right? But to get a little bit of that in here, and especially if there's like a section like this where I can see there's wear along that specific part, right? To actually focus in on that part of my texture as well, and assume that like that part of the weapon is also mainly like the grip handle part, yeah. But just adding a little bit of muddiness to this texture right now to give it some variety. Alright, working with a bigger brush. And going back and kind of doing some give and take, maybe getting that mid-tone again to lower some of those effects. Really just trying to see, okay, like what kinds of things I can do here to match that effect. I also, right, made this these strands of cloth across here, so I might want to paste those in there. Oops. From the color channel here. You're not copying, guy. So just where I can see the bump map is also going to be working. So again, this won't be kind of my final area because I want to, oops, I'm working on the wrong channel, the wrong layer. I want to stay on that cloth layer, right? And mimic those lines that I had in the bump map, right, to really accentuate where the light is catching that top of those strands of cloth. So once I've got that laid down, I can hide that layer because it's kind of muddying up my view a little bit. And to pull some of that redness out by just using muddier colors. Oops, I forgot to select it. I'm going to go overboard. So just so I forced color within the lines, right? Go back to this. And then overlay with a less saturated color to retain some of that texture, but without being quite so noticeable. Right? I don't want the texture to look pure. So I just want to zoom out and check how it's looking from further away. Again, working with large and small brushes. Select that area again just to make sure I'm coloring within the lines. So the way I like to do this is to work on one part for a short while, like say this cloth. Save what I've got, right, I've got that piece in there, save that, and then go back to another area. So I can close and reopen Hypershade. Should catch that handle area, right? So it's never going to look quite the same in Maya as it did in Photoshop, just because once it's in 3D, right, you're looking at smaller sections of it, and maybe the saturation, right, needed to be a bit higher there so that I kept that red color a little bit more prominent. But I'll keep looking for places that I can work more detail into the weapon, and just keep chipping away at this texture until I've really like covered every little part of it, right? So that includes going back to these edges, right, getting a very light small brush and doing little scuffs and chips along all of these little edges where the weapon is going to be show the most signs of use. Oops, I don't want to have round bits there. I just want to have straight cuts. So I mean, doing like X kind of shapes along here, right? And maybe even like scratches or chips along the main part of the weapon, right? Where you might have parts that have like deflected a weapon previously. Then I also want to make the, oh, I don't want to go so bright on these. I want to make the sharp edges also kind of stand out on my weapon. So right now I'm working with kind of a textured brush. So I'll go back to harder brush. And anywhere that I'm going to have kind of a sharpness, right, or bladed edge, I want to make sure I go along that edge and add that shift in height through the texture. This also gives me the opportunity to smooth out the curves, right? So it's not quite as jagged as the model itself. This is kind of where I can make the sharpness of a 3D model appear a lot softer. And you see that a lot in like the World of Warcraft or League of Legends artwork, right? Where they're using relatively low poly stuff, low poly models, but their textures are so soft and cared for that it makes everything feel like very hand modeled and beautiful. So I'll get back and catch any parts. I did some overlap. Oops. Alright, so this is an opportunity to improve the look of your model where you're taking it from a very kind of technical execution on the 3D modeling bit and you're moving towards more of an artistic expression of what you originally wanted the model to look like. So I wanted all of this stuff to be a sharp edge, so I'll just trace these edges here. Maybe I might want to go a little bit further in to make it seem like more of a chopping blade. So on these areas, right, I'm using this opportunity to soften those curves or to actually make them seem like more curvy than they are on the low poly model. Versus in other areas, like on the gem, right, I'm actually going to accentuate the sharpness of those edges. So just do a quick save and check up. Looks like I'll need to go a little bit further in on these curves here. So that's also why the UV map is important, right? Because it shows us where the geometry is, and we can really like push and pull those areas to the right level to show where the kind of bladed or sharpest edges should be. So you're really deciding which geometry to accentuate, right, to draw attention to, and which geometry, like this middle geometry, um, where you want to kind of remove attention from or lead the eye away from. This leading edge here, I'll just do this bit. And right, this one is important because the very front of the weapon, it's going to have a lot of attention on it. And then when I made my cuts, right, this was kind of the area where the edge starts to fold downwards, or the steel starts to fold downwards towards the edge. So I might not want such a sharp line on the inside, and I might want to have a little bit more of a gradient going for me. But again, adding a little more curvature in here than the model has, right, just to soften out all those areas where I tried to save polys in the modeling stage. So that's the real strength to this hand-painted style, is that you spend a little more time on the texture painting, therefore you can optimize how few polys you're having to use in the 3D model, just because a lot of devices won't be able to push polys, but it doesn't matter how complex the 2D texture map is, right? Because the 2D texture map is red as a color, whether it has a lot of variation in the color or only a little bit. And so here again, I can see some areas where maybe the geometry isn't quite matching my intention, and if that's so, right, I might just want to keep pushing it further and further to match the layout here in the UV maps, right? So if I find that, right, I really wanted those edges to be really sharp when I was in the planning phases, and that edge went all the way up. Looks like maybe I had them go and cut in like this, these triangles. So anyway, this is the method that you're going to use, right? You do a little bit of painting, hide your UVs, save it, and then update in Maya to check on how it's looking. The only thing is that it does take a lot of time to do the painting. You also have to think about your other maps, right? So in this case, right away I can say, okay, now that I have a series of scratches along my object, I copy that, and I would assume that those scratches also affected how shiny different parts of the object are, because what's actually happening there is certain parts are exposing the raw steel underneath, right, which is shinier, and other areas, right, that should remain untouched, right, should stay the same level of shininess. It's just like on a steel blade or something, you would have the sharpest areas catch the light a little bit more, and then the other areas would be more shadowy. So this is now my specular map that I'm updating. If I save that, right, I can also check. And there I can kind of see that these edges are a little shinier than the area inside them, probably. Alright, so the last maps that we need to worry about are the alpha channel and the glow map. So from here, I'm going to go back to my color map, just use this as my basis, right? And let's start with the glow map. That's the simplest one. So I'll just do a save as again and save as glow. I don't need the scratches channel anymore since now I'm working in the glow channel. Don't need the cloth stuff anymore. It's because everything in the glow channel is going to be black except for the gem. So I'll select the gem area and then I'll invert that selection. And I'm just going to hit D to reset my colors to black and white, and then fill everything with black. So this way, all of these other pieces, right, will no longer glow or will not glow, and yet the gem area will glow whatever color, right? It will actually emit light in whatever color I have assigned to that specific area. So I have my glow map now. I'll save over that one. I'll open up my color map again just so I've got it there, right? Same exact layout. From here, go back to my texture. This is going to go in the blend slot, it goes into incandescence. So I'll link in a file. Right now it's looking like the whole thing is glowing, so now I'll tell it no, just the gem should glow. So this is a little hard to see, and it won't really be visible in the viewport. Maybe I can get it showing in a render. So it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see it reflecting a bit of light in here, like green. Let's see, so incandescence. It might just be that my light is a bit too bright. So turn down the lights a little bit on my sky dome. Let's see if that helps. There you can see how it's emitting light, right? So in engine, this would be easier to adjust to emit more or less light depending on your needs. Of course, if I had a very dark scene, it should be very obvious that it's glowing, right? Like here. Cool. Alrighty, so the very last part for this weapon, or my weapon, is to get these bottom parts to be see-through. Right now, this is just a piece of geometry, or it is two faces because of the way transparency works. It's only visible from one side. without a special shader command. So to get it to render from both sides, I just made a face on each side there. Then in my UV, that sits here at the top. So I want all of this gray area to be invisible, and I also want to cut a hole in the center of these to make them more like a ring. I'll go back to my color map. I'll do a save as and change it to the last part of the file name to alpha. Let's save. So once again, I don't need any of the texture stuff because an alpha channel is only going to need to see which areas are visible and which areas are invisible. So since this part inside here is the only area that is going to need to be affected, I'll just select that and then invert my selection, make a new layer, and for an alpha channel I want to set everything that's visible to be pure white and everything that's invisible to be pure black. So now I'll go and I'll fix this selection here to remove these color bits, right? This part should be, oops, visible. So in this layer here, those bits will be white. And then the parts in the middle of the rings here will be invisible. Well, all the rings should be visible as well. So let's check the color layer again. Tolerance is too low. So everything in here should be white except for the center of the ring. Flow is too low. So right here in the center, I want it to be see-through. Right here, I'm on the color channel, that's alright. To be see-through, and then here as well, all of this cloth or this plane I want to be invisible. So that will also be pure black to make that invisible. Right, so alpha channel looks alright as it is. The only other piece that I wanted to mess with here was the gem. So let's just hide that for a second and capture that little piece where the gem is. Now the gem I don't want to be completely invisible, and I don't want it to be completely visible. I want it to be somewhere in the middle, but mostly visible, right? It should be able to be a little bit see-through though. So I'll get a light gray color and fill the gem with a light gray. That way I can hide my UV map, save it because I've already named it alpha, and go back into Maya. Now there is an extra step for this besides adding it to this texture. So first let's just go ahead and add it to the texture. Blend. Gonna look for transparency, which is the second slot. Choose file, choose the folder, click on my alpha channel file. Now by default yours may look a little bit odd at this point. This is because of the way that the viewport is set up, right? So your weapon might suddenly become see-through, and it might not look how you want it to look. So to fix that, we need to go to the viewport, the perspective view. Oh, there you can see the ghostliness that's appeared, right? It's kind of see-through. You need to go to the renderer menu inside viewport, choose display options, and inside of transparency algorithm, change it to alpha cut. close. Then inside of Hypershade, I'm going to go into that transparency slot and turn on alpha is luminance. That little checkbox there will then create the effect that I'm going for, which is to have those bits be see-through. Looks like it's actually made the gem super see-through. Not sure if that's going to show up in the render as well. Looks like in the render it looks fine, but I guess with that little fix you gain one piece and you lose the other. So those are going to be our channels though. I believe we hit all of them: alpha, specular, bump map, glow, and then obviously our color channel. Spend most of your time working on the color channel. Try to separate out layers a little bit so that you can then copy them, right? Say like in the scratches, I would copy that layer and then put it into the specular layer by using paste special. Yeah. And it's just a matter of coming into the hypershade, right? When you set up a new material, and this goes for Unity as well, right? Setting up a Unity material. It's just a matter of inputting all of those files into their respective slots, and the renderer will take care of the rest. So that's all I wanted to show you guys for texturing using Photoshop. However, there is one more bag of tricks that you could potentially decide to use for this project, which is to go the route of using Substance Painter. So I'll do a short tutorial on Substance Painter and give you guys that option in case you would rather use some PBR materials or materials that are kind of built to reflect light the same way that they do in the real world. So let's end the stream there. Thanks for joining, and please spend some time on your models, giving them some love in the texture. You want this to be really touched up and pretty by the end. What I would recommend is to go and grab some nice source images, right? So what I would do, say for the gem, I think I demoed this to the class, but I'll work it in here. Is to really like use a reference image, right, and to try and replicate some of these cool shapes that you're going to find in a piece of reference that you wouldn't necessarily be able to imagine just you know, by sort of with your imagination. So do go back and find reference images. Use the method of kind of doing a give and take between highlights and lowlights, right? Or highlights and shadows, adding a little bit of detail, changing up the color, also differing your brush size a little bit, right? And not necessarily worrying about what it looks like at first. Obviously this is not what I'm going for, but I do need to just keep working at it, right? Like it's not gonna appear to be working in the first like second or two, but this is what painting is all about, right? We don't paint the Mona Lisa in 5 minutes. It takes a while. Yeah, it takes some effort. So do experiment with this stuff, right? Do use reference images. Try to look for opportunities to create some of the same shapes. And then another thing to do is to just experiment with colors, right? Because not everybody has a knack for colors. But like I've mentioned, right, if you do find out that this is something that you're good at, you can make a career out of just painting textures. Like if you're really good at it, people will flock to you to give you work, right? And ideally, you'll be able to um, create your own models, right? Even if they're low poly models, and texture those models by painting them rather than relying on too much software. So one thing I'll do on the gemstone here is I'm just going to highlight the cuts, right? The actual geometry here is important because it gives it that gem-like quality. And I can see on my reference, right, these lines actually catch the light, right, along the edges. I also have areas of maybe where the light is a bit more shadowy. Right, versus areas where it's a little more airy and bright. And those kind of mid-tones as well. Right, these things you want to do a little bit of work on. Hide your alpha channel at some point, or your UV map at some point. Save it down, go back to your actual model. Now in this case I've got to compete with the transparency map. I might want to pull that transparency map off, right, just so I can see the progress on this gem. And since I also have a glow on that, right, it's going to lessen my any shadows on it. So I will have to think about that. In this case, I could even go so far as duplicating the gem and having it have an internal geometry as well. But since it's such a small object relative to the scale of my weapon, I'm not going to worry about doing that. So those are our I broke my alpha channel. Alpha limits to transparency. I'll fix that. Do it. So work on these texture maps, right? This should take you a few hours. It's not going to be as simple as a one-click solution, but I will give you guys Substance Painter tutorial real quick as well, just so that you can look at that. What the best artists are going to do, right, as I showed in, looks like I closed that. The best artists are going to use Substance Painter to get a start for their models, right, for their textures, and then they're going to come and touch it up in Photoshop anyway to add any little details that they think might be missing. So consider using that full route as well.